Calling a game that took over 7 years to develop unfinished feels ridiculous, especially so for a game of Silksong's polish. On first contact, Act 3 was an exciting continuation of what came before, and despite being spoiled on it, it was still surreal to witness the scope of the game bloom further than I once thought possible. Pharloom changing, now consumed by Void with all its bug inhabitants dead or undistraught, further exemplifies how adaptive and responsive Silksong's world is. And the gauntlet of bosses that let the player further hone their skills in its tight combat system continued to be engaging and satisfying. But upon reflection, something felt off. It felt unfinished, like it was tacked on, a separate part of the game with half-baked ideas that was isolated from the otherwise cohesive and thoughtfully put together experience. By no means does this ruin the experience for me. I still love Silksong and enjoyed Act 3, but its flaws are so loud that the excitement of finally playing a game 7 years in the making couldn't hush them. Before we talk about Act 3 itself, we should talk about how to get in it. There are multiple requirements, with the biggest one being completing almost every quest on the wish boards and from NPCs. I think it's a mistake to gate Act 3 behind completing all of them, because let's be real, most people just want to see Act 3 after being in Act 2 for tens of hours. And the time spent solely to meet the Act 3 requirements is not insignificant, far from it. It's quite uncharacteristic for a game like Silksong, which has been unafraid to hide significant portions of content like entire areas or amazing bosses behind secret walls, to then require you to go through the busy work of finishing all these quests to see the final act. It's doubly worse when taking into account the actual quality of these quests, most of which are just fetch quests where you kill X amount of guys, or sometimes you literally just follow a trail. I like the idea of quests as optional goals that make grinding less boring and more structured for players that need that additional help, especially in a game this challenging, but making these mandatory feels terrible and it's just boring. Quest systems in Metroidvanias are peculiar to me because they usually don't serve much of a function. Maybe the problem is the execution, but more often than not, quests will make you backtrack to a specific area you've already been to multiple times. Such a goal feels unnecessary in a genre that's all about exploration and backtracking. You probably will walk through the same hallways and rooms more times than you can count. So what are quests even good for, especially ones this shallow? Well, brain-dead quests can still be okay as a mental break from the action. The problem here is that Silksong's world and exploration is of such an exceptional quality. I have no idea why anyone would prioritize completing quests over filling out the map. I hope that's not just me projecting. You're bound to finish some quests as you explore, but unless you're hyper vigilant in dovetailing quest completion with exploration, you're likely to have some backlog of quests that you'll need to clear up all at once. This weaponizes the calming nature of brain-dead quests into a boring slog once you have to complete multiple of them in a row. But aside from being boring and wasting your time, I think the biggest failure here is that it takes away from exploration and the world. As I said, most quests already require backtracking, so why not just remove the quest part and integrate it into the world? For example, there are a multitude of quests where you hunt for a trail. Why not have these clues and signals out in the world to begin with instead of appearing only after the quest is accepted? This would make exploration more rewarding and the world more immersive. Observant players will be able to pick up on these environmental clues to find new content and rewards, and you still could maintain the quest system if you wanted. If a player were to miss these details, a quest could appear that will give more details on what to look out for. It's a shame that this potentially rewarding experience was exported to a far inferior system, but the problem doesn't end there, because the way some of these quests are completed feels so artificial it becomes immersion breaking. Going back to the trail hunts, it makes no sense for the clues and the NPCs to appear out of thin air. Having them only appear after accepting the quest is so video gamey and poorly executed. Silksong puts incredible attention to detail in its world to make it as immersive and believable as possible, but all that immersion runs into a brick wall when it comes to quests. Why can't we enter this alcove in the slab, or hear the broodmother's wail until we accept the quest? Why can't we enter this door in Whitewater until Sherma does it for us? There's so many quests that I think could have benefited if they just weren't quests at all, and I hope I made that point clear. It's not like Team Cherry doesn't understand this. The first quest of the game requires you to collect 3 moss berries. These can be collected before meeting the moss druid. They are just part of the world for you to interact with. So that was a lot of time spent not talking about Act 3 in a video that has Act 3 in the title. I think it's vital to establish this because the dip in quality in the endgame starts many hours before Act 3 starts. The video is just titled this way because Act 3 is a clearly defined part of the game. I think it's fair to critique the quest system since it's mandatory, and probably what you'll be spending the most time on to unlock Act 3. The slow and mediocre build up to the final act further amplifies the frustrations I have with Act 3 itself. It's not uncommon for games to end off with some sort of boss or combat gauntlet, but having to deal with hours of boring quests is a whole different story. At the very least, combat maintains a high level of quality, with Karmelita and Lace being the standout fights. But combat is just one part of the game. It arguably isn't even the best part. It's a testament to the game's quality that such a finely tuned combat system isn't the star of the show when it would be for many other games. My favorite part by far is the exploration, so where the hell is it in Act 3? Let's take a step back to recount what happens in Act 3 and give it the praise it deserves when necessary. After the Void tendrils spring out of the trap to take Grandmother Silk along with Lace, Pharloom collapses and is consumed by Void. Hornet awakens in a weakened state after a long fall from the cradle and is now trying to get back to safety, the environment completely destroyed and the Void's presence filling the air. Descending back into the Citadel, you'll face off against Void-touched enemies from the Underworks, and this is the first time you'll see the Void attacks. Defeating them and descending further, Hornet takes another fall that knocks her out, eventually being woken up by Sherma, who has assumed the role as the new caretaker of Songclave. This opening does an incredible job in establishing the destructive force of the Void. Its presence seeps into every wall, in every screen, in every environment. The short combat encounter is also terrifying. The enemies are very tanky and the fight lasts much longer than you would expect. You need to deal with these new attacks on low HP. I think most players are already familiar with the Void from the first game, but I have to imagine someone who's seen this for the first time must be able to feel its oppressive power as well. After Sherma patches up Hornet, she decides to find the caretaker for answers, not before facing against the Bell Eater. Hornet finds the caretaker in the ruined chapel, only to discover that she's a snail shaman, along with the maid and the hermit. After the confrontation, Hornet travels to the deep docks and with the help of Ballo, descends into the abyss using the diving bell. There, she comes by a weave nest containing the Silksoar, and with a newfound ability, escapes the abyss. Let's talk about the abyss because I think many people may take issue with my critique on the lack of exploration and point to the abyss as a counterexample. After all, it is a new area with unique enemies and unique environments. But a new area does not equate to more exploration. Just because the abyss has its own title card and spot on the map, that doesn't make it the same as areas like Greymore or the Coral Chambers. I think a better comparison would be to the Red Memory. These are areas you go through and experience, not areas you stay in and explore. They are incredibly linear and play like interactive story sequences, with the new enemies and environments serving as the backdrop. It's nothing like the big interconnected areas you get lost in and backtrack through. This isn't meant to be criticism of these sections themselves. Finally seeing the abyss with the familiar Void tendrils and the deep nest stack station in the Red Memory were memorable. You could call this fan service even, but I don't care. I was honestly so excited going through these areas. These areas don't need to be sprawling to facilitate exploration because their story significance and atmosphere can carry the experience. I'm complaining that these areas aren't large and explorable because of a general lack of exploration throughout the whole act. And it's not like every new area is as interesting and well presented as the Abyss or Red Memory. Aside from being small and linear, many of these new areas are noticeably disjointed from the rest of Pharloom. Some are situated at the far ends with almost no connections to other areas, like Abyss and Verdania. And most don't even exist on the map at all, like the Coral Tower, Red Memory, Void Nest, and Bright Vein. Before we move on, I want to give a quick mention to the escape sequence in the Abyss. It's awesome and really scratches the platforming itch I'm looking for. It's intense and satisfying to chain long strings of inputs together as the lava rises. It's unfortunate that this is where platforming peaks in Act 3, and wow does it go downhill from here. The main issue is how overpowered the claw line is. It covers so much horizontal distance, it trivializes any platforming section that isn't made with it in mind. With the claw line, such sections don't require much thought and aren't mechanically engaging since you don't have to use most of your abilities. Most of the sections that do require the claw line are still really boring since they don't demand anything more than that. It's just use claw line over and over and over again with no variation. Every mandatory platforming section after the Abyss escape is a joke in comparison. Trivializing platforming can be fun in its own way, and I would even say it's a mark of good level design when simple areas can be easily backtracked, since it gives the player a sense of progression by letting them zip through early areas with their newfound abilities. But given the amount of time spent in Act 2, like completing quests, I think the player already has had more than enough time flying through rooms. I think it's fair for me to expect a higher level of complexity in platforming for how late Act 3 is. As we delve deeper into the Abyss and into the Weave Nest, we acquire the Silksoar ability. By this point of the game, I was shocked to have received another ability, but also excited and curious about how the game would utilize this. One of the most exciting parts of playing a Metroidvania is acquiring a new ability because it opens up so many possibilities in exploration and movement. Unfortunately, this excitement quickly turned into disappointment. The Silksoar is very underutilized. Getting it so late means there aren't many opportunities to use them, and its long windup makes it nearly worthless in combat and platforming. The best abilities are ones that are multi-purpose, enhancing platforming and combat simultaneously. That's why abilities like dash and double jump are such staples of the genre. I will argue Silksoar fails in both aspects. If an ability doesn't grant much utility aside from unlocking new areas, it risks being a glorified key to lock doors, an ability that isn't interesting or exciting. I still wouldn't call it pointless, just disappointing. At the very least, the presentation of the Silksoar is great, it feels epic, and that you're really flying through the air. I find that the Silksoar in the Coral Tower really emphasizes the completely unrealistic and gigantic scale of its dreamlike area, and the Silksoar at the end of the Abyss escape is a fitting ending to the tense sequence. After escaping, Hornet returns to the Snail Shamans. They teach her the Elegy of the Deep, so she can acquire 3 powerful hearts needed for a spell to retrieve the delicate flower from her memory. The location of the 3 powerful hearts is marked on the map, and they aren't exactly the most useful. These map markers show the exact location of the item instead of the entrance to the area. Since most of these hearts are actually quite far away from the entrances, these markers end up being incredibly deceptive and difficult to find. Unlike other parts of the game, you'll always have empty spaces on the map to explore, but the areas accessible with Silksoar are often hidden on the map itself. By this point of the game, I had already spent so much time in the world, and I wasn't at all interested in backtracking to dig for these areas. The changes in the world aren't significant enough to warrant another round of backtracking. At least one of these is a freebie to find, Crust King Khan in the Sands of Karak. When you enter his memory, you awake on a dimly lit floor, rays of light that beckon you to soar high. It is then that you are thrown into the beauty of the Coral Tower, its bright blue and lively background that contrasts the floor you awoke from. The Coral Tower is an unrelenting gauntlet that requires you to clear 30 waves before reaching its only checkpoint. That's a lot, maybe even too much for some. I won't delve into the difficulty talk because that's enough for its own video, so I'll just say that the Coral Tower is incredibly difficult and a true test of endurance. I honestly wouldn't mind if these gauntlets were easier and the boss was harder. Regardless of the difficulty, I want to praise how there is such a high quality and variety in the designs of enemies and environments this late into the game. Seeing a whole new set of enemies this late into the game is incredibly impressive and ensures that there is at least something new to engage with in this tiresome gauntlet. Even the filler enemies like the giant jellyfish that act as silk fodder look so good. At the end of the tower is a boss fight against Khan, one that I found to be very simple. I still found the fight really enjoyable because the boss is hyper-telegraphed and I was able to learn the punish windows on the spot. Despite my desire for Khan to be more complex, I'm definitely not complaining about having a reprieve from a difficult section. That's why I don't share the same complaints about Grandmother Silk being too easy because I found Lace 2 to be very challenging. Still, it's not hard to look at the footage from the trailer and the maps from ACMI Games World and not be disappointed with what we got. It makes the impressive enemy variety and environmental design feel hollow because we know for a fact that the Coral Tower is cut content. The knowledge that there is so much cut content for the Coral Tower is one of the main things that made me view Act 3 in a different lens. It's partially why I mentioned at the very start of the video about Act 3 feeling unfinished and tacked on. Removing this context and judging it for what it is, I think the Coral Tower still holds its own, but other parts of the hard quest absolutely do not. Reaching Karmelita and Nyleth shows how boring the Coral Tower could have looked like if there wasn't already the reserve of assets for Team Cherry to reuse. What may be the worst piece of mandatory content in Act 3 easily goes to Nyleth at the Grand Gate. When you enter the area, you are greeted with Shellwood. This area doesn't just give me Shellwood vibes, it's just Shellwood. Maybe there are some minor differences, but the lack of enemy variety doesn't help. How's it possible that the whole area has one enemy, and somehow that singular enemy is reused? The difference in enemy variety and environmental design between the Coral Tower and Grand Gate is unbelievable, and it's hard not to just look at the whole section as being flat out lazy. Because once you get past that, you still have to deal with the minuscule platforming section that is so easy and simple. It feels like complete filler. The only saving grace in this whole section is the fight against Shrine Guardian Seth, which is honestly quite a good fight. I think he's kind of forgettable because he feels so random, but in terms of quality, Seth is definitely one of the better ones in Act 3. I had a lot of fun figuring him out. After you defeat Seth, you finally get access to the real boss, Nyleth. And wow, is it bad. What makes this boss bad is that trying to play optimally is too boring. There's nothing mechanically difficult about this fight. Its attacks are very easy to avoid if that is your only goal. However, the mark of a good boss extends far beyond your ability to beat it hitless. Beating it hitless must still be fun. Many of her attacks are unpunishable and as a result require you to play incredibly passively. Her Pollen Cloud, Bullet Spray, and melee attack can't be punished without putting yourself in massive risk. The only attack that can be consistently punished well is her charge attack, but waiting for her to cycle through her attacks and waiting for the one attack you can punish is incredibly boring. I almost see this as a form of artificial difficulty, one that bores the player so much it causes the player to overextend and face tank hits because they just want the fight to end faster. And again, the boss is so mechanically simple, it's not hard or interesting to avoid her attacks. At least in the first phase, the presence of the floor lets you punish the boss much easier and sneak in more hits. The removal of the floor in the second phase is probably the worst phase change in the whole game, because it dramatically drags the boss fight by reducing the punish windows, while failing to add any complexity to the fight. The lack of a floor forces the player to constantly hug the wall, which just so happens to be the safest place you can be in. If anything, the second phase removes complexity and fun from the fight by limiting skill expression while failing to add anything new. Going through the Grand Gate to fight Nyleth comes at a stark contrast to what is easily my favourite part of the hard quest, fighting Scar Singer Karmelita in the Far Fields. This part of the Far Fields is by no means transformative, but I think it strikes a great mix of familiarity while mixing things up and innovating in appropriate ways. After you Silksoar into the ceiling with Karmelita's statue, you will come across rings attached to these tall, skinny poles. It's only after you harpoon onto one of them that you realize how flimsy these are as they bend under Hornet's weight. It's such a simple gimmick that surprised me with how well it fit the area, while also subverting my expectations. You come across many rings you can cling onto, but this gimmick is not used anywhere else. Despite how much I like this gimmick, it's hard not to feel like it's somewhat unfinished. While the presentation is worth praise, the game doesn't actually use its mechanics in any interesting way. It feels like this gimmick never comes out of the introductory phase and remains something that you barely have to pay any attention to in order to proceed. So much so that replacing this gimmick with just regular rings wouldn't change the platforming at all. I would have loved to see this gimmick be explored more. Another part of this area I loved is when you come across these hardbone hoppers, the same ones you see at the start of the game. Right after them is a larger version called Hardbone Elders. I first approached them with confidence, thinking they were just another piñata for me to hit, but was shocked to see that they actually had an attack. The game has had other enemies with larger variants that aren't too different, so seeing these enemies retaliate was another subversion of my expectations that I enjoyed. But the best part is the next elder you come across, which can be seen fighting the small ant warriors from Hunter's March. This moment really stands out to me because it's one of the few times that enemies are seen fighting each other. In fact, I can only think of one other scenario. It adds so much to the immersion and believability to this world, because it shows that Pharloom has its own ecosystem, one that exists independent of the player, and its inhabitants actually do things aside from just attacking Hornet when she happens to be nearby. It's also a neat way to show how the ants get their bone mass through very direct environmental storytelling. It's these minor details that make the Far Fields far more memorable. It's enhanced by Act 3 and makes the area actually worth revisiting. So despite the very linear exploration and lack of interconnectivity, it still stands out from the rest of Act 3 as one of my favourite sections in the endgame. And of course, we can't forget about the star of the show, Singer Karmelita, who is by far the hardest boss for me. I don't think I ever fully nailed down this fight, but it was fun once I beat it, and I'm sure there's a lot of satisfaction to be gained from mastering this fight. The presentation and OST of this fight is absolutely incredible, and the vocals stand out. I do think that the enemy gauntlet right before the boss is incredibly unnecessary, and doesn't add much to the encounter. Even though you can clear it fast, it feels like a huge drag given how there already is a waiting time to play the Needleland and enter the arena. Aside from the 3 places marked on your map, there's a hidden 4th heart you can obtain in place of any of these. If you free the Green Prince in Sinner's Road, you can find him mourning his lover at the edge of Greymore, and enter his dream into lost Verdania. The lush greenery is beautiful and stands in stark contrast against the dark, decrepit ruins that we see in present time. Like the Coral Tower, Verdania is fitted with its own unique roster of enemies, except Verdania itself is an actually explorable area with its own gimmicks. Frankly, it's breathtaking, and was the closest I actually got to giving that feeling of discovery I wanted. The surprise of finding a new area in an unsuspecting location that expands the scope of the map further than you could imagine. Lost Verdania definitely feels like the most fully baked new area in Act 3, which makes me wonder why out of all the 4 hearts, this was the one they chose to be optional. I think Verdania stands out from the rest of Act 3, but that is in part due to how lackluster Act 3 is. I find there is still much to be desired from this area. My main problem goes back to the gimmicks being underdeveloped. There's a few new ideas that this area introduces, the main one being these glowing orbs that you have to collect on a timer. So many of these sections are comically simple. Some are so easy I think you would need to try to fail them. Such challenges include running around in a circle, this happens twice by the way. The other gimmick you'll find are these large green bulbs that sprout out green fruits on the timer. These are a lot more engaging, and I especially like the brick shrine room. Its openness stands out from the narrow spaces of Verdania, while also allowing for a bigger area for platforming. Chaining through multiple of the large green bulbs felt like the satisfying platforming I was looking for. Despite that, Verdania still felt disappointing, because the sense of Karak already executes these time-based platforming gimmicks in a more engaging manner and way earlier in the game. Verdania doesn't just have half-baked gimmicks, it feels like a direct downgrade of Karak to me, a comparison I couldn't get out of my mind throughout my playthrough. Along your way through Verdania, you'll come across the Pale Stag, which is probably the worst boss in the game. This boss reminds me a lot of the dream bosses in Hollow Knight, in how it literally has one move and just teleports everywhere. It has the same problem I spoke about with Nyleth, where the boss is so boring to fight that it just makes the player want to face tank it and overextend just so it can end quicker. The dream bosses were the bottom of the barrel in boss design in Hollow Knight, and so too is the Pale Stag in Silksong. The real boss here is the Clover Dancers, which is a remix of the Clockwork Dancers. Unfortunately, they are nowhere near as memorable as their Clockwork counterparts. The Clockwork Dancers excel in their presentation, with how music is vital to the boss fight, and how the anti-climax last phase subverted expectations while seamlessly telling a story through gameplay. The Clover Dancers have none of that. Regardless, they are still fun and satisfying to fight on a mechanical level. Before we move on from the hard quests, I would like to take this time to sum up my issues with Act 3 since the end of the act is actually really strong and I don't have much criticism for that. Act 3 doesn't provide much of what made the rest of the game so enchanting. I think the only part it succeeds at are the story moments and bosses, even though the boss roster for Act 3 is admittedly quite inconsistent. The lack of new areas is a disappointment, and the new areas that do exist feel underdeveloped in their gimmicks. Even with the few new ideas introduced, I couldn't help but wonder what could have been if these ideas were developed as extensively as other gimmicks are in the rest of the game. What if the poles in Farfields required you to bend them all the way? What if you had to go in and out of Lost Verdania, with actions in the dream affecting the present and vice versa? What if the lily pads were required for platforming? Maybe a room with the glowing orbs that require you to set them up beforehand? This lily pad trick is only done once, which is a shame since it's so clever and fits the area really well. Act 1 and 2 shows what Team Cherry is capable of, which makes much of Act 3 feel all the more lazy and hastily put together. The lack of any large explorable areas, with many of them being much smaller, linear, and disconnected from the map really makes much of Act 3 feel tacked on, lightly stitched together with the otherwise large interconnected world you spend so much time in. This linearity persists throughout the entire act, and while linear doesn't equate to bad, it doesn't fill the gaping hole of non-linear exploration that made the rest of the game so special. And no, the hard quest doesn't count. Being able to choose between different linear paths that are completely separate from one another isn't non-linear exploration. I also partially wonder if the problem here is over-ambition or scope creep. Given the interview with Jason Schreier where Team Cherry says they were having so much fun and could have continued making the game for years, I wonder how much of that time was actually spent on the endgame. If there was no end in sight, it's easy to imagine the end being much more rushed compared to everything else. I say this because the game has more than enough content for a 3-act game, and it feels like Team Cherry spent all the time making new things for the first 2 acts and neglected Act 3. Maybe the problem isn't a lack of polish or effort in Act 3, maybe it's an improper division of content between acts. Some stuff would have to be tweaked, but I don't see why you couldn't make the Sands of Karak Act 3 exclusive given how its main purpose is the Coral Tower. That's just one example. Returning back to the main story, Hornet brings the 3 hearts to the snail shamans for an intense ritual that lets Hornet delve into her own memories. The raid memory is one of my favourite sections in the entire game, and I think it's the best story moment. From the faded visuals to the somber track that plays, the atmosphere of the sequence is immaculate. You witness Hornet's childhood in Hollowness, her reconciliation of a half-worm, half-beast self, and how her 3 mothers raised her to who she is now. Undeniably, much of the love of this sequence is the callbacks to Hollow Knight. Revisiting familiar areas and faces was exciting. I also do think a big part of why it works is because we grow an attachment to Hornet. She may not be the most emotional of characters, but her personality is really defined through her dialogue. The game in general is also a lot more explicit about its story compared to Hollow Knight, so it's likely that once the player reaches this point, they actually know what the hell is going on. At the end of the memory, Hornet finally obtains the Everblue. Awakening from her slumber, she delves back into the abyss, the diving bell renovated and ready to go. Descending into the abyss, Hornet meets Lace one last time and takes the final dive into the sea of darkness, Everbloom in hand, plunging deep into the depths of the void into a cocoon. You find Grandmother Silk stretched thin, and behind you arises the final boss of the game. I don't think it's controversial to say that Lost Lace is one of, if not the best boss in the game, and a great capstone to this journey. Lost Lace really embodies the dance between 2 characters that people speak so fondly of about their favourite fights, and it is for this reason that Lost Lace is my favourite fight in the game. It's a great blend of memorizing attack patterns and quick responses from the player. And how can I not mention how great this OST is? I really enjoyed the ramp up in difficulty between the 3 Lace fights. Lost Lace reminds me a bit of Nightmare King Grim from Hollow Knight, in how some of the new moves she does is taught to you even before the fight begins. Some of her void attacks are the same ones all the way from the start of Act 3 with the underworld enemies. It's a great way to add more complexity to the fight without making the learning process too overwhelming. I love how aggressive the boss is against you, constantly phasing in and out to attack. She's always in your face. The play pattern is quite different from other bosses for this reason. Most of the time, you're the one that chases the boss down to get in hits, but against Lost Lace, you wait for her to come to you and punish her. I found this to be incredibly fun, but I've heard this be a sticking point for some, where they feel like Lace just appears on top of them in an untelegraphed manner. I think some players just won't click with the more passive nature of this fight, and maybe the game needs to do a better job in telling the player that since you're allowed to chase many bosses in the game without being punished. I've also heard some disappointment about fighting Lace for a 3rd time as the final boss. I don't share this complaint, but the Radiance in Hollow Knight is undoubtedly a much more grand spectacle in boss and arena design befitting of a final boss. Regardless, I feel that Lace 1 is just a warm-up round, much like all the early bosses till Morwing, so fighting her for a 3rd time didn't feel excessive to me. The main problem with this fight is the visual clarity. Black on black on black is bound to result in some attacks being obstructed or camouflaged. The main culprit are the void tendrils that spring out from the ground. They can be obscured by the silk thread in the foreground at either ends of the room, or even worse, be covered by the voiceoars. You definitely can spot them if you're observant enough, and this is only a minor issue I have. Otherwise, this fight was a perfect end for me. After a long fight, Lace emerges from the ground, clear of void. With Grandmother's silk strength, Honor attempts to Silksoar back to the surface with Lace, but comes up short, the Everbloom disintegrated. But the Knight comes to save them, and slowly drags them out of the sea of void back onto the surface. And there lies the end of the player's journey in Pharloom, and a journey of mine as well. Thank you so much to those that made it through the end of this video. I'm not even sure how many will even hear this part. Creating a scripted video like this is something I've thought of over a year ago, and after so much procrastination, I finally did it. To those that know me for Geometry Dash, this is obviously a huge departure from anything I've posted on my channel, so thank you for giving this a chance. And to those that know me IRL, thanks so much for your support. Aside from just making day-to-day life more fun and worth anything, it's really fun to finally talk to people about games after not talking about them for so long. And so many people, even those that aren't into gaming that much or those that I don't get to talk to that much, will mention to me about all those silly game reviews that I post. As much as I wanted to finish this video for my own sake, I must admit that a lot of the motivation to finish this also comes from knowing that the people around me would appreciate it if I did finish it. So thanks. I don't know how many more of these scripted videos I'm gonna make, if it's a short-term hobby or a longer one. I'm definitely not going to become some whole night channel, just general video essays or critiques on games. Hopefully this isn't the last time I see you guys in this type of video. Hopefully this can be a new beginning.